But first, it's a pretty brave person who questions the orthodoxies of the left these days, but what seems to be the accepted wisdom is not always right. In a fine piece of commentary this morning, the former editor-in-chief of the Australian newspaper, Mr Chris Mitchell, deplored the tendency to cancel anyone who dissents. In this case, Liberal backbencher Craig Kelly, whose views on climate change and the pandemic are sometimes a little over the top, but never without some basis in hard fact. Mitchell quotes Bjorn Lomborg, the Swedish academic and advocate who is convinced that climate change is real and that mankind is making it worse, but who thinks we need to subject climate change policy to the same kind of hard-nosed cost-benefit analysis that's applied almost everywhere else in policy in democracies like ours. Based on the United Nations' own figures, climate change could produce a maximum 2% reduction in annual GDP by 2070, but that the world will be more than 3 times richer by then. Well, Lomborg has come to the obvious but unfashionable conclusion that there's no climate emergency and no existential threat, that what might happen in the future could readily be managed if we keep our economies strong rather than weaken our economies, and if we invest in new technologies and adaptation rather than shutting down modern life as we know it, at least in the West, given the levels of climate activism we have here that's not shared by other countries around the globe. Moreover, Mitchell argues getting to net zero emissions by 2050, mainly by moving from fossil fuel power to zero emissions power, will require, in another study he quotes, installing 3,000 new wind turbines, 250 square kilometres of solar panels, 2,000 megawatts of nuclear power. Any one of those 3 options, he says, every single day. That's why the whole net zero argument feels more theological and practical, with countries that have totally failed to deliver on their existing emissions commitments now making ever more extravagant new commitments by way of atonement to the political faithful. Or perhaps making new commitments further out in time. They hope, don't they, that no one will notice they haven't come anywhere near meeting their current commitments, and somehow the voters won't notice. Listening to the ABC or reading The Age or Sydney Morning Herald, you'd think Australia was a climate change pariah, and that New Zealand, for example, is a messiah when it comes to global emissions. In fact, in Australia, we've reduced our emissions by 13% since 2005, while New Zealand has increased by 4%. What's more, Australia's on track to reach our Paris 2030 emissions reduction target of 26% based on technology, not taxes, and with a minimal, if any, impact on GDP. When New Zealand has at least tried to own up to reality, is the fact it's had a go at costing what a move to net zero emissions by 2050 might look like. I'll tell you what, it's a big economic hit, with a government study putting the annual cost to just under 0.2% of GDP, or around $12 billion a year. On the other hand, a private analysis from the Institute of Economic Research says that New Zealand's GDP would be a whopping 16% lower than otherwise in 2050 if they make this change. And that's even with agriculture exempt, which is their main source of emissions. Now, later in the program, I was speaking to former Nationals Cabinet Minister Matt Canavan about the Morrison government's possible move to a net zero 2050 target. It's worth noting now, though, that the Morrison government won the 2019 election, as we know, at least in part because Labor was committed to an emissions target with no costings and no clear path to achieve it. So having won once by exploiting Labor's mistake, why would the coalition want to make the same mistake itself by taking an uncosted target to the next election with no clear way to achieve it, other than an utterly unrealistic build of renewables or a politically unpalatable, sadly, shift to nuclear? It's the science, though, isn't it? We're told it's all about the science, says the climate zealots. Science that supposedly says we must cut emissions to zero by 2050 or do irreparable damage to the environment. But hang on, as Mitchell points out today, on most contentious issues, the science is far from settled. For instance, given their different pandemic policies, all, we're told, supposedly based on science, COVID science obviously differs from state to state, from one chief health officer to the next. I mean, they can't all be right. So why the contradictory messages on COVID science, even in one country like Australia? This is where I go back to the factual reality. Australian voters have overwhelmingly shown at all recent federal elections that they want to do the right thing by the environment. Absolutely, we all do. But Australian voters reject the green politics of the left. Rather than focus on promises that are out there on the never-never, 2050 and beyond, commitments for a moment in time that's 3 decades away, how about governments and policymakers focus on today and on the dams, the manufacturing industry, the cheap power, all these things that they have promised time and time again, but are still yet to deliver?